we might say faith, this man is demonstrating. Do I do that or do you do that, Andy? You do that. Got it. Okay. Only speak the word and let my servant be healed. Verse 8, for I also am a man set under authority. And that, I think, is the key verse for this passage, or at least one of them. This story isn't just about Jesus's capacity or power to heal. This is about Jesus's authority. And it's driving us toward a question, the next story will too. Who is this guy? Who is Jesus? The story about the centurion captures a powerful moment and a powerful component of Jesus's identity. He is one who has authority, not just the power to heal, but for some reason, somehow, this man has authority, and it's a Roman centurion who's telling us about it. It's a Roman centurion. The enemy is revealing something about who Jesus is to us. Fascinating. It says, I also am a man set under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and the slave does it. And when Jesus heard this, he was amazed at the centurion and turned to the crowd that followed him, and he said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found that the slave was in good health. Turns out the centurion was right. If you only say the word, my servant will be healed. A couple of fascinating things going on here. One, we're beginning to see as we make our way through Luke, and I hope that that you're taking Pastor Phil up on his invitation to read through Luke Acts. There's something so powerful about reading through the gospel, through the story of Jesus. So often we take stories, we just kind of lift them out of their broader context and study them, and that's not a bad thing to do. But when we read through the story, we get to hear the fullness of the story and the way in which the author wants it told. And one of the things that we begin to see early in Luke's Gospels, we're building a case for Jesus's identity as one of authority from another source. His authority is not given by his position in the world. His authority is not given by his credentials. His authority is not given by his popularity. His authority is born of heaven. And Luke's building that case for us. We see this in the centurion's words. We also hear that the story of Jesus and the work of Jesus just isn't for Israel alone. It ain't just for the church folk. And how many times, I promise I'm not making it up, how many times have we seen this in the Gospels and even in the Old Testament? That the story of God isn't just for those who look right, act right, talk right, and sound right. It's for the centurion too. It turns out when Jesus teaches about loving your enemies, he doesn't just use words. He puts it directly into action. I think that's part of why Luke records this particular story, because it's a great illustration that Jesus wasn't blowing smoke. Jesus wasn't saying, hey, if you have time, or if you consider it, or if you think about it, pray for your enemies and love them and bless them. He puts that directly into action by loving a centurion whom everybody hates, or at least they ought to, because he is the enemy. He's the personification of the evil empire. That's who the Roman centurion is. Okay, let me stop there and ask for questions about the first story. Yeah, Chris.
I was going to say, so they're supposed to hate him, but everybody sort of reveres him. So I guess what they're saying is, in your enemy, they're people.
Yeah, good point. Good point. So there's something about this guy that's likable, and he seems to have made a connection with the people in Capernaum, at least, which was a Jewish town. So perhaps it wouldn't have been surprising for the people who knew that centurion to see Jesus respond that way. But remember, this story travels far beyond the local context of Capernaum. So when people in other parts of Israel hear that Jesus has healed a centurion's servant, that Jesus has served a centurion, they're going to miss that local context. Oh, no, this is one of the good guys. This is one of the good guys. They're going to miss all that. And so I think that's where you hear the love your enemies story really begin to play out.
It's a story in the other gospel.
Is this story in the other gospels in Matthew chapter 8, verse 5 through 13?
Nice try, Fran.
Do I get an A for today?
You get an A. Good. Any other questions or clarification online? Anything I can answer for you guys before we press on? Okay. Now, second story, I think, is a companion story. What I mean by that is it doesn't happen at the same exact time. The connector word is soon afterwards. But I think it's a companion story. And remember where we started. The story isn't just about Jesus' ability to heal the centurion's servant. There's a broader context there. There's a love your enemies in action component to this. There is an authority from the heavens component to this. There's more being revealed about Jesus than just he's a miracle worker. We're going to hear the same kind of thing in the next passage. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain. So let's see, I think we can travel to Nain just a little bit. and now this Zoom controls are blocking Nain, but that's okay. They can stay there. That distance, Mr. Stillwagon, is only about 5 miles, give or take. And Mount Mora, we can go to the next slide. We can zoom in on good old Mount Mora. Mount Mora is right there. Mount is a bit of an overstatement. We took the kids skiing this year for their big Christmas trips. We saw the Rockies. First time the kids have been to actual mountains. First time they've seen real snow. And now they come back to the North Georgia mountains and they say, "Can we call this a mountain?" And that's kind of Mount Mora. They're arrogant, those little jerks. We're gonna fix that. Don't worry. But Mount Mora is really more of a large hill than a mountain. And the town of Nain sits right there. That's modern day. So it's a satellite image of modern day Mora. That's modern day Nain right here. This is the tell on which ancient Nain was, and there's a community that's there today. Again, similar to the first century synagogue, I like that these cities are found. We haven't found all of the biblical cities, that's okay. But I like that we know where biblical Nain was. Because again, the story takes place not hovering above the earth, and it takes place not in Narnia either. Right? It's not a fantasy other world. The story takes place in real dirt that you can travel to even to today. That's where our story takes place. It is a small Jewish community. It's out of the way. It's not really on the major trade routes. This is a town really of zero significance. So one of the questions that we can begin to ask, and you can ask these questions yourself as you read different parts of Scripture, when you see a community like Nain named, one of the questions we can ask is why? That's not an important town. Why does Jesus travel there? Why do we have this story that takes place in Nain? Let's see what happens. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. It's only 5 miles, an easy journey. And as he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. So we enter into the scene in a funeral procession. Remember that Jewish custom dictated that the dead would be buried outside the city walls. Contact with dead bodies rendered you unclean. And it's not that you couldn't have contact with the dead. That was a necessary part of the ancient world. But you don't want to bury the dead in the city walls. We don't want to be that close to the dead. So there was a procession that would have taken place as the dead man is being carried outside the city gates. And you really want, I think for this particular story, you want to travel in your mind to that day. You want to travel in your mind to a funeral procession. Remember, Nain is a tiny community, probably only a couple hundred people, similar to Nazareth, only a couple hundred people. And so everybody knows this guy. Death is personal in the ancient world in a way that it has been sanitized for us. Right? For us, we keep death at an arm's length, and we have other people do the burial preparation. We have other people do the burial itself. We stay at arm's length, not so in the ancient world. Very, very personal. It's an up close and personal event. When a young man in a community of this size passes away, So transport yourself. The entire community is carrying this man out to his burial place. He was his mother's only son. That's an important detail. If he's his mother's only son, then she has no children to take care of her as she ages. She has only her husband. And she was a widow. So she doesn't have her husband. So we need to capture the precarious position in which this woman is now found. She has no husband and no son to care for her. Right? The biblical, the Israelite community, the Israelite civilization was built around the family. And the family was built around the patriarch. And the patriarch was charged with the care and the provision and the protection of all within their home. So when you found somebody without a patriarch, without a husband or a son, then you're talking about somebody who is on the outside looking in. This is why God makes special provision. You might remember back to our study of Ruth several months ago. We really dug into this. When you find somebody who's outside the family, they are in a particularly dangerous position. This is why God makes special provision for the care of orphans and widows, because they have no one else to help them. So God says, people of Israel, you will care for the orphan and the widow because they stand outside the normal mechanisms for provision and protection. So we get the picture that this woman is now not only grieving her lost son, as she carries her son's body to the same place that she at one point in the past carried her husband's body, but she's also in a dangerous position. She was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. Remember, this is a communal experience. When the Lord saw her, when Jesus saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." It's a crucial moment in this story. I want to argue it's a crucial moment in our story. When Jesus unexpectedly comes upon this woman in deep grief, in deep pain, in deep danger, Jesus' response is to step closer. Same thing we heard with the centurion. When people come to Jesus and say, "Hey, there is a sick guy over here," Jesus' response isn't to put a hand out and say, "I'm so busy and I have so much to do right now. Please don't bother me." His response is to lean in, not lean back. It's exactly what he does in this story. He says, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier. Does anybody know how to say this word? B-I-E-R? Beer? Okay. It's always good. I didn't know Jesus touched the beer. So he touched the beer. This is what would you say, a cart? This is platform. This is the thing that you carry the deceased on to their burial place. Jesus reaches out and touches the bier, and the bearers stood still. Another hugely important detail is awfully easy for us to skip over. One, we don't know what beer is. But two, it just feels like we're telling a story. Remember, contact with the dead is very improper. Contact with the dead makes you unclean. But what does Jesus do? He reaches out and touches it, and it brings people to a standstill. Right? Jesus' response isn't to lean back, it's to lean in. His response isn't to put an arm's length in front of him. His response is to grab hold of that which causes despair and to bring it close. And Jesus said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The shock and awe of Jesus stopping a funeral procession is doubled down as Jesus begins talking to the dead guy. You can imagine people thinking Jesus is insane now. And so we've got to get out of our familiarity with this story and remember how absolutely, utterly insane it was for Jesus to talk to a dead guy. We're only in Luke 7. We're not at the end of Luke where Jesus himself is rising from the dead. We're not at the end of Luke where we've already seen Lazarus raised from the dead as well. We're at a place where Jesus is talking to dead guys and saying, rise up. And the people around him are like, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind? At least that's how I imagine it. And the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. And fear seized all of them, because of course it would. Wouldn't you be terrified if you were suddenly dropped into a what do you call those things? Not a mummy, what's the undead? What are the undead? A zombie. If you were suddenly confronted with a zombie, of course you would be afraid. We would all be afraid, and that's exactly how the people respond. They're filled with fear. Fear seized all of them, but they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people. Now, this is where we begin to realize something. We might be missing something. We might realize it for two reasons. One, they all seem to claim a great prophet has risen among us. Why is that their response? Well, why would the people see Jesus raise a guy from the dead and say, a great prophet has risen among us? It's an odd response. And then these next words that they speak, God has looked favorably on his people. God has visited his people is another way to translate that. That's a very Old Testament phrase. This isn't God paying social visits to people. This is God has visited us in Egypt and carried us out of slavery into freedom. It's a very Old Testament phrase. A great prophet and an Old Testament exclamation about God's salvation. What is there missing in this story? What I want to suggest, and I love this, it's one of my favorite stories for this reason. What I want to suggest is that we have stacked stories, stacked by geography and stacked by action. We know that Elijah raised a man from the dead. So you have, maybe this is why they call Jesus a great prophet, is because they call back to Elijah. Now, Elijah raised a man from the dead somewhere else. I can't remember where, somewhere in Judea, somewhere south in Israel. But Elijah wasn't the only Old Testament prophet to raise somebody from the dead. There's a man named Elisha who raised a young boy from the dead. If you go to 2 Kings chapter 4, you can read the story. Elisha is traveling. He finds relief in the home of a couple who has no kids. And they feed him. They give him a room to stay in when he's working in the region, kind of a WeWork situation. And so they feed him. And Elisha, over time, builds a connection with his family, hears of their despair at not having children, prays on their behalf, and lo and behold, a son is born. Such an Old Testament story. A barren woman, a couple with no kids, a sign of God's displeasure or disfavor with them. But they are faithful, and Elisha prays on their behalf, and a son is born to them. But later on, that son dies. Elisha hears of it when the son's mother comes and says, what gives? You gave us a son. God gave us a son. God responded to your prayers, and now God has taken that son from us. What gives? The mother has traveled to see Elisha. Elisha travels back, and he goes into the room that was his own room in this couple's house, where the son is laid, who has died, and says to the boy, get up. Do you know where that story took place? That story took place in a small town called Shunem. Do you know where Shunem is? Let's see. It's right there. Mr. Stillwagon, that is less than 1.5 miles away from Nain. It's a stacked story. What I want to suggest, and this really is built on the work of a guy named Jack Beck or John A. Beck. If you're looking for some great accessible commentaries, I beg you to go buy anything that he has written. And the argument that Jack makes is that this is a stacked story, stacked by type and stacked by location. Because listen to this, if you grew up in Nain, in the ancient world, you think you don't know? If you were a Jew in Nain, you think you don't know what took place on the other side of the hill? You think you don't know that Elisha, one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history, raised a man from the dead 1.5 miles away from your home? What do you think the kids are doing on Saturday mornings? Not watching cartoons. We're walking up onto the hill. Who are they walking with? Probably mom or dad. What's mom and dad telling them about? Hey, there's Shunem. Let me tell you what happened in Shunem. Let me tell you about the time that Elisha visited our Mount Morah and raised a man from the dead. And now, 600-700 years later, Jesus shows up in the same place and does the same thing. This is why the people see a great prophet has risen among us. The Lord has visited us. What is it that it says? It says, God has looked favorably on his people. Why do they do that? Why do they say that? Because they're recalling what God has done here. And we are beginning to see that Jesus' authority, Jesus' power isn't just in the miracle that he performs in healing the centurion servant and raising this boy from the dead. Jesus' power and authority come from elsewhere. This isn't just a simple run-of-the-mill miracle worker. This is someone great among us. We know the end of the story, so we sometimes assume we already know who Jesus is. But when you read through from beginning the story of the Gospels, the story that we hear in the Gospels, we get to let that story, that identity unfold upon us. And what a gift it is, because it reminds us all over again of who Jesus is and how Jesus interacts with us. So I love where N.T. Wright takes this. N.T. Wright says, okay, so now look forward in your own life to that time when you are carrying the funeral bier. That time when your child or your sibling or your father or your mother is being carried out. Look forward to that time when you find yourself on the outside looking in with no one to care for you, with no one to provide for you. Look forward in time to that moment of despair because you don't know what to do next. What is it that we see Jesus, and in fact, God himself, do? What do we see Jesus do in that moment? We see Jesus draw near, not repulsed by the impurity of death, not repulsed by the impurity of desperation, but drawn in to touch it, to speak to it, and to transform it. Look forward in time. Maybe you don't have to look forward very much at all. And see what Jesus will come to you and do and say. This story is stacked not just geographically, not just by type according to Scripture. This story is stacked on human experience. It is all of our lives. And what God was doing in Elisha, it's the same thing that God was doing, only more in Jesus, which is the same thing that God desires to do for you today. So let me pause there before we move to questions. Any questions for clarification? Anything you want to dig a little deeper into or challenge me about? You're more than welcome to say, I don't see it.
What was the name of that author again?
John A. Beck, or Jack Beck. Yeah. He's got some great video content out there. And he's got two in particular. He's got a lot of biblical atlases, which are really fascinating. And yeah, I hear you laughing. I know they are fascinating, jerk. And then, gosh, it's one that read some of the other names.
Land Without Borders, Land of Milk and Honey.
Amazing.
I believe the Bible. Edge of
Visual guide to biblical events, visual guide to gospel events. Those two in particular, very accessible. Whether you are a Sunday school class leader or somebody who just likes to learn a little bit more, oh my goodness. So he'll take a passage and really in 2 pages, he was one of the editors for this, so he didn't write all of it. Really in 2 pages, he'll dig in on a single story. So it's not like you have to read 7 chapters to learn about Shunem and Nain. You read 2 pages, and what he's able to just help us uncover, I think, is phenomenal. So more than worth your time and money. Other questions of clarification?
Yeah. So I was thinking, whenever we suffer a loss now, right, we often go to each other and tell ourselves at some point after the fact, they're in a better place with our Creator, but that's not what I hear Jesus coming to say in some of these stories. Is don't cry because he's with the one who sent me. Don't cry because he's in a far better place. And right, that's not what he says. He brings the person back from presumably there. Like what?
Why doesn't he still do that?
Well, or like why doesn't he comfort right the same way that we tend to comfort now?
Oh, interesting. So Stillwagon's question is, why doesn't Jesus comfort in the way that we comfort, right? When people die today, we say, well, they're in a better place. Jesus doesn't say, oh, they're in a better place. It's okay. Don't weep. I think what Jesus says is, don't weep. I am with you. Don't weep because I'm here. And I got to tell you, this story lands a little different for me. I'll get you back for this. I got a call last night at 10. So my dad has stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He was just diagnosed, and story lands different. I'm with you. Not, I'm going to make it go away, but I'm with you. I know a lot of y'all have been through similar situations, and so you know the power of that. It lands a little different when you're staring it in the face. And I'll take it. I'm with you. Don't weep, I'm with you. I'll take it. So, I have much to pay Stillwagon back for, and want to invite you into some conversation. We have 3 questions. They shouldn't surprise you by now. I think that's our last slide. Yep. What does this story say about God? What does this story say about my faith? Does this story change, or how does this story change the way I should live today? I wrote those questions before I got that call. Shoot. All right, friends, let's break up.
Hey, good morning to the guys online. Can you hear me? And Matt, if you can find a way to mute that speaker up there, and probably the microphone too, if you don't mind.
Andy, can you put the questions in the chat?
Yeah, hang on just a minute.